really, really lucky to have somebody here tonight of this caliber who has made the journey from Manhattan to come out here and give us some of his time. Hopefully you've all read his book, Bumping into Geniuses. I can only tell you that our guest tonight is very unique in that I can't think of anyone else in the business. I was trying to figure it out today, whether there's somebody who has run several record companies as the key operating officer, directed a film, has had a successful career as a manager, and was a journalist and a publicist. I'm trying to think, I don't know anyone else in the business who is still active or not even active who had that resume and that depth of experiences from all different sides of the entertainment business.
Basically, I couldn't hold a job.
Anyway, he's being overly modest. The only person I can compare you to, and I hope you don't take this wrong, was Irving, because he did run a record company and a management company, but then he didn't produce and direct a film like you did.
He produced FM.
Well, that's true.
He produced a couple of movies.
All right, so maybe you and Irving have some similarities.
I'll take it.
Except you're taller.
Yeah.
Anyway, his name's Danny Goldberg. You should all know by now. If you don't have the book and you haven't read it, shame on you, and you're going to need to have read it by the end of the semester. I can assure you of that. Danny started out, if I'm not mistaken, as a journalist and then graduated to a publicist. But what's fascinating is he was CEO of Mercury Records, CEO of Warner Brothers Records, president of Atlantic Records, vice president of Swan Song Records, which is Led Zeppelin's label. And I mentioned he did start his career as a journalist working for a trade publication. One of them at the time was Billboard. He then had his own label and a participation and ownership there, Artemis Records. And it's interesting, he's been involved in, if you look at the timeline of rock and roll, I mean, Danny Goldberg was there, when Led Zeppelin was, at one of its many apexes and responsible for that, helping launch Bad Company at the time. And then when another music revolution came out of Seattle, I hate to use the cliche grunge, but here's the man who was involved very much so with Nirvana as their manager, and I think he would acknowledge the fact he was also more than a manager, but he was a friend to the family as well as the band. Yet today, he still is extraordinarily active with his own entity, Gold Village Entertainment. He's got a few small artists under his umbrella. Some of you, I'm sure you're familiar with them. Steve Earle, the Swedish rock and roll band The Hives. Any Rage Against the Machine fans here? So you're familiar with Tom Morello, is a client of Danny's. And if you recall the Cranberries, Dolores O'Riordan has joined the stable. Also has some other artists you might be familiar with, Alison Moore, Ian Hunter, Joseph Arthur, the old 97s, Ben Lee, Rhett Miller, and a new band which I think you'll be hearing a lot about. They're from Brooklyn, very young, I guess preteen even, right?
No, they're 13.
13.
Yeah.
Called Care Bears on Fire.
Yeah.
So you'll be chuckling now, but when you turn the radio on 6 months from now and you hear it and you can't get the song out of your brain, you're going to go, that was that guy that night. He told us about that. So I'm just telling you, over the years, Danny's been involved. I mentioned, of course, Nirvana. There was Bonnie Raitt, Allman Brothers, Courtney Love's band Hole, Beastie Boys, Sonic Youth. Anyway, we're really lucky to have him here. And we won't hold this against you, but you're responsible for, in one way, for the Baha Men.
Who let the dogs out?
Which
3.2 million units.
Made a lot of, right.
Yeah.
Any of you have gone to see the documentary More Nukes? That was Danny's brainchild and a successful soundtrack. And touring, I guess later this week, in the Garden and at the Meadowlands is Fleetwood Mac. And when I first really got to know Danny, second round, was he was running an independent label called Modern Records, and the marquee artist, who was really the founder of the label from an artistic point of view, was Stevie Nicks. So you have a man here who's got a pretty well-rounded plate of all sorts of things, and I said very uniquely able to comment and talk from various positions as a record executive, as a manager. His wife is a very successful entertainment lawyer, and oh yes, he also has a real life because he has 2 kids. So he's a dad. So I'm happy that he made the time to come out and share some of his insights with all of us here tonight. One of the things I wanted to start talking about is the mind of the artist. I mean, there's something different. Everybody in this room, I would assume, plays some sort of musical instrument. Is that true? Yes? Yeah, okay. So, a musician or an artiste, like, different person than other people who don't. There's a passion, there's a desire, there's a need to do something that other people don't have. And you've been able to sort of harness that and shape and make that into a business for them and be able to, in most cases, make a living out of that.
In most cases, I've been able to make a living, or
No, they have. They have.
yeah,
And hopefully to the extent where you can share in that.
That's my
But
job.
like,
yeah.
what is, okay, that's your job.
Yeah.
So your job is to take their or in your mind, your job is to take their artistic output and somehow monetize it?
Yeah, I'm not. I don't have any. I don't play an instrument. I just never had the motor skills to even play the guitar or the piano. And I come into it as a fan who figured out how to get into the business in the late '60s, and over the years developed some skills that are valuable to artists. And whether it's a record executive or personal manager, it's a similar role, which is trying to guide the business part of what they do, somewhat through marketing, and sometimes through negotiating.
But what's in the mind of the artist that makes
Well, no
it that
two
way?
artists are the same. First of all, I think that anybody who's successful wants to be successful. I never met anyone who was successful by accident. The old cliche, the mountain doesn't go to Muhammad, Muhammad has to go to the mountain. Even the most brilliant people, there are a lot of very talented people that never became successful because they didn't have the drive and determination, almost obsessiveness, to make it. There are people with drive, determination, obsessiveness who just aren't talented enough to make it too. You need both things, but certainly to be a, the late movie star Ruth Gordon said in an interview once, to make it in show business, it's not enough to have talent. You have to have a talent for having talent. So I think that what she meant had to do with that kind of a thing. So certainly the success piece of it requires an ability to focus and take rejection and come back, and it's a lot of work. The talent part of it really is a mystery, and I think it's the creative process is. I mean, what's great about it is that it's a mystery. You can't quantify it or measure it with a computer. Just how a song is written. People can write hundreds of songs, but one of them is memorable, and you can't get the melody out of your head. And the same with a lyric or a guitar part or a beat. And two can seem so similar, but one gets people all over the world. MIA does something, and all over the world people are kind of going with it, and 500 other people with the same tools, miss by an inch. That to me is a wonderful mystery, and I can't explain how people do it. I can just from time to time recognize it. Not always. I've missed a lot of things that happened, and I've believed in a lot of things that didn't happen, but I've had enough of a batting average to be able to, have the career that you described.
But what excites you so you want to get involved with that musician or that artist, whether from a record company as an executive, you want to sign that artist to the label, or you want to sign that artist to your management company? What's the magic there?
Well, the business is, the kind of music that I know the best, and most of my career is involved with, is rock and roll. It's certainly not the only kind of music. There's all other successful genres, and certainly for the last 15 years, hip hop has been a bigger musical movement with young people and commercially, and there's pop music and country and all sorts of other genres. Rock and roll to me always was kind of the bastard child of art and commerce. There's no such thing as the early rock and roll was a novelty thing only about making money. I mean, I think the first big rock hit was Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock or something like that, or Elvis. But early on, there was also an artistry to it. And so that contradiction or the tension between art and commerce is what attracts me. I definitely care about money. You can't run a business and not have the arithmetic work. You have to have more money coming in than goes out, unless you come from a family that's just going to subsidize you, which I certainly did, and most people don't. So I don't think you can just ignore business if you're going to be successful. And artists don't want managers or record companies to ignore business. The people that become successful, like I said, want to be successful, and they want to be involved with people that are thinking of that. On the other hand, for me, and for a lot of the people in the business, not everybody, but a lot of people, and I know you're like this, there's also kind of a need to care about it. So I look for something that I think is going to be successful and can pay for my time, or when at a record company justify the investment, and that can, at least if I can't directly be a fan, because as I get older, I'm not like a teenager, and the heartbeat of pop music and rock and roll and hip hop is the teenage audience, at least that I can put myself in the head of a teenager and understand what they would like about it and get excited about it, because it does help. There were a lot of depressing and difficult times in the business, and it's much easier if at least you care about what you're doing to get through them. So I look for that. Personally, I look for the combination. If I just love it and I don't think it can make any money, I can't afford it. And if I just think it'll make money, but I don't feel something about it, I won't do it, because it's just too hard during the bad times if you don't care at all about it. I grew up at a time in the shadow of Bob Dylan's music and the great guitar heroes, and I tend to gravitate more to great singer-songwriters or great guitar players in terms of what personally moves me. But there's a lot of other kinds of music that are important culturally, and from time to time I've been lucky enough to work with that. But I tend to mostly stay in the zone that I can understand better.
So Steve Leeds graduates college. He's really, really lucky. He gets a job working for Atlantic Records as a promotion person, going around New York City trying to get records.
That was your
played.
first job?
That was my first job.
That is so cool.
I was very, very fortunate and very lucky. But what I was really fortunate and lucky was the first executive outside of the immediate people I worked with who befriended me was this young fellow who worked at Swan Song Records, Danny Goldberg. Who's he? Well, go and meet him, because he runs the label, and they got Led Zeppelin, but they're also putting out this album by Bad Company and a couple of other artists. And then there's this big party at the Four Seasons to announce the launch of Swan Song Records. This guy's got a Led Zeppelin t-shirt back there. So I understand your background was a journalist and then a trade person, and then somehow in the book you talk a little bit about it. They did the band, Peter Grant, the manager of Led Zeppelin, decided we need something more. I guess Rolling Stone was not being very nice, and the band was never getting the respect.
Well, Zeppelin, I met them when their fifth album, How's the Holy, came out. I gotten a job at a PR agency. It was kind of a show business PR agency that had mainstream people like Frank Sinatra and Barbra Streisand. They wanted one rock and roll person, because rock and roll was this business that was coming up, and I was recommended to him. So I was the guy with long hair. I was skinny in those days and had cheekbones, and Zeppelin became a client of that company. And when I met them, they'd already been really famous. Led Zeppelin was successful right away on their first album. Jimmy Page had been in the Yardbirds, which was a critically acclaimed group, and they came along just when FM radio was starting to play rock and roll, and it was the first time that artists could reach a mass audience without having like a pop song, and they were one of the first beneficiaries of that new thing that, in those days it was actually called underground radio. And so they were successful right away. So by the time I met them, they'd had again, this was their fifth album. They'd already done Stairway to Heaven. They played arenas all over the world. And but they had never gotten good reviews and good press. It's hard for people who are fans to think of it that way because they become so iconic as one of the pillars of the history of rock and roll. But at that time, there was a generation of these rock critics that were maybe about 5 years older than the band or than the audience for the band, and who preferred the Beatles and Rolling Stones and the San Francisco bands. Rolling Stone magazine came out of San Francisco, and Zeppelin was perceived as an imitator of the Stones and of Cream, and not as an original group by these writers. Partially because of their age, because at 23 or 24, they were at that point 6 or 7 or 8 years older than kids in 9th, 10th, 11th grade. So even at 23 or 24, those rock writers were sort of removed from what the next generation of young people was really into. And even at 23 or 24, they had that attitude of, well, music's not as good. These kids don't get what good music is, like I did in my day when the Stones and Hendrix were starting. And then there was also kind of a jealousy, I think, institutionally, that the rock press had, because the band didn't need them for 64, 65, 66, 67, 68 to become famous in rock and roll, like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix. Magazines were a big part of it. Rolling Stone magazine came out in 66, 67, and even Life magazine, because the radio stations were only playing these pop records. And Zeppelin became famous. So those artists were all beholden to the journalists, like the Stones always kissed the ass of, and Dylan of the writers. And Zeppelin, was like overnight, like instant coffee, big. So between those different factors, they were just excoriated by the critics here and in England. It was the same syndrome in the UK. And they decided, like a lot of successful people, they accomplished a series of things. They made money. They were selling at stadiums. They had big records. So now they wanted to get good press. And they had this rivalry, psychologically anyway, in their mind with the Rolling Stones. And the Stones had just done a tour of the United States where Truman Capote, the great writer, went on tour with them and wrote about them for the New Yorker, and they were on the cover of Newsweek, and they became this, mainstream level of celebrity. And I think the members of Zeppelin were jealous of that, even though they made plenty of money. They were making actually more money than the Rolling Stones at that time on the road, because they had more young fans. And so it was another mountain to climb. So they hired this company that I was working for, and we were able to get them good press. It was, I write about it in the book. It was just, kind of educating the journalists and exposing them to the crowds and saying, you may not like it, but the audience does, and that was, and the band was happy enough with my work that they, the next year they then hired me when they started this label, Swan Song Records. Again, it was imitating the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones had had their label, Rolling Stones Records, so Zeppelin wanted their label, Swan Song. And Zeppelin ended up having a more successful label, because they did break one other act, Bad Company, who you mentioned, whose first record went to #1 and sold millions of records. And the Rolling Stones never broke another act. So that was how I got there, and how I was in that office to say hi to you.
So not to belabor the point, but if somebody here wanted to find out more information on that period of time and the history of Zeppelin, there's several books. Is there one that you think
Other than mine?
Right, one that deal exclusively with Led Zeppelin. I mean, Hammer of the Gods.
Hammer of the Gods is probably a good Zeppelin book. There's a number of good ones. There's an anthology that came out last year, which is the Led Zeppelin book, that looked pretty good to me. But I think Hammer of the Gods is a decent history of the band, certainly for the earlier part of their career. That seems to be the one that stood the test of time.
So you wrote a book. Why?
Oh man,
second book, right?
It's my second book, yeah. I'm one of those people that from the time I was very young, in my mind, I was always writing a book. Like I always was like kind of narrating in my mind this, I don't know, I was just the nerdiest kid in the world, or whether I just liked books or had some insane ego that anyone would be interested. So I always had this idea that I should write books, but actually doing it is, as very difficult. And I was not a very good student. I guess today they would have called me ADD. But as the years went by, I developed more discipline, the ability to write longer things, and I kept notes. And in the back of my mind, I always figured I would write this book. I'm working with some famous people. I started as a fan and a rock writer, and I just thought it would be fun to share some stories. And both books that I wrote a previous book kind of about politics and pop culture were times when the rest of my career wasn't doing very well, and I was nervous and scared about becoming marginalized and invisible and unemployed. And so one of the things about writing is you don't need an investor or a guitar tech or you can do it yourself. And although I found it difficult to start both of them, I really enjoyed finishing them, and I recommend it to everybody. It's a journey worth taking, regardless of how many people read it. It's a accomplishment that you can put on the shelf. And a lot of things in life are kind of ephemeral, and it's nice to have some things that are concrete and you can look at. So I just but the timing of it was a combination of where I was in my own career, and I felt the first chapter I wrote is the last chapter in the book, which is the chapter about Warren Zevon, the late singer-songwriter who died in I think '99, and who had recorded his last 3 albums on my label Artemis. And he's a guy, I don't know how many of you followed his career or know this, but that he got diagnosed with cancer, some kind of lung cancer and liver cancer that's caused by asbestos or something. And he knew he was dying, but he was able to make this last album while he knew he was dying. And there's David Letterman did a whole show with him. Letterman loved him. He was the substitute band leader whenever Paul Schaefer would go on vacation. And the only 2 times in the history of the Letterman show, he had only one guest on for the entire show. Once was Al Gore, and the other was Warren Zevon when Warren knew he was dying. And it was an emotional thing, and that was the one time where I knew for sure I was going to write about this. I knew for sure this was such a human drama, his courage in the face of death and his wit, and so many great artists participated on the album, Bruce Springsteen and Don Henley and Tom Petty and Ry Cooder and some movie people like Billy Bob Thornton. And I just knew it was such a remarkable thing to watch a guy who was so articulate and alive intellectually, knowing that facing death with great equanimity, mixed with terror, as you would expect. And so that just wrote itself. It was just so. And so once I had that chapter, I just figured I might as well try to write the rest of it. So I started with the ending because that was just so clear. It had a beginning, middle, and end to it. And but it's I wish I admire and worship writers. I wish I was a natural writer who could write a lot. I find it difficult, and it takes me many, many rewritings to even get it up to average. But I really love the process, and I love the results. So it's definitely worth doing. But
you did start as a journalist.
I started as a journalist, but not as a successful journalist. I was never a particularly successful journalist. What happened is I went to University of California, Berkeley. It was the thing was, again, I was a bad student, but I had good SATs because I didn't do my homework, but I guess was smart enough to take tests well. And Berkeley, you could get into if you had over 1,200 SATs, you just got in, no matter how bad your grades were in those days. And the guidance person in my high school said, just go to Berkeley. You're not getting in anywhere else. So, so. And it was, I got to Berkeley, it was 1967, right after the so-called Summer of Love. I went to Winterland, which was one of the rock emporiums run by the late Bill Graham, and Janis Joplin's group, Big Brother and the Holding Company, were playing there. And this beautiful blonde girl with a diaphanous see-through white gown was wandering through the audience giving out free tabs of LSD. And I had a hard time concentrating on classes after that. And dropped out, came back to New York, and I needed a job. I was 17. I graduated at when I was 16 from high school. And through an ad in the New York Times, got a clerical job at Billboard, not because I knew what Billboard was or that I knew what the music business was, but because I needed a salary so I could get my own apartment. And I discovered after a month or so of being at this trade magazine that there were people on the other side of the office that got to go to concerts for free and write their opinions about them. So I had low self-esteem, but I knew I could do that. And to be a rock critic is not really that complex a task, especially for a trade magazine. You're writing 4 paragraphs, and you're only supposed to write nice things about everybody because it's a trade magazine. So the writing part of it was pretty easy. And then I wanted to sort of see if I could be a successful rock writer, and wrote a few reviews for Rolling Stone, and worked for some other magazines. But I never, there were people that became great, I think, journalists out of that time. And, you know, some of them are still right today, like Bob Christgau, and some of them, Bob Hilburn and other people. I never got to work for the New York Times or anything like that. I was just too much of a fan. I only wrote nice things. And to be a successful critic, you've got to have a mean streak. And I have a dark side, but I kind of worship artists. And I just didn't feel... One time I wrote a review of the group called The Rascals. They had a series of pop hits in the 60s. They're kind of blue-eyed soul. They're from Long Island, you know. And I really liked The Rascals. They were not really profound group like Dylan or Hendrix, but I just liked The Rascals. And so I wrote this review, but I wanted to be respected by critics. So I put in one kind of snarky line where I said, you know, in Gene Cornish, the guitar player, twanged his guitar. Because the Rascals were driven by these two keyboard players who were these great vocalists. And the guitar player was kind of a secondary figure during a time when other bands had these amazing guitar players like Eric Clapton and Hendrix. So it comes out on a Monday, and on Tuesday the phone rings in the office, and it's Gene Cornish, the guitar player of the Rascals. And he says, hey man, it really hurt my feelings. He said I twanged the guitar. Like I really spent years learning how to play the guitar, and I take it really seriously. I don't twang it. And I felt so guilty that I never wrote a bad word about anybody again, which made me really a lame critic. So I was born to be a PR guy, not to be a critic.
But journalism has been a great stepping stone for you in the beginning, and your writing, it's almost like cathartic.
Well, I'll tell you one thing about journalism. It's a fantastic entry point, and now with the internet, it's very difficult to get paid for writing things. But the great thing about journalism is you have a byline. It's one of the few things you can do in an early stage of your life that you could put your name on. And it's a tremendous thing. You Xerox, well, in those days there were Xerox machines, you know. You can Xerox it and show it to people and show it to your parents. And it's like, it's an identity. And I'm grateful to it for that. But I never really was a very good journalist. I think I became a decent book writer over the years, but I had a hard time with it. I liked doing it, but you know, I wasn't really in the ranks of the great journalists. I really wasn't. But I was a great publicist.
There's a quote in your book: artists hold the real power in the business. I've never seen it so succinctly articulated that way. Might you want to talk about what that really means?
Well, you know, there's a thing going on now in the business where Ticketmaster, which is the company that prints up and processes a lot of the tickets, is trying to merge with a company called Live Nation, which is the biggest concert promoter in the country. They do more than half of all the big concerts, and so I got to go. There was a Senate committee had hearings on this, so. You know, I have a reputation for being kind of a big mouth and left-winger, and so I got a call from the staffer for the, I guess it was the Commerce Committee. It's Senator Cole from Wisconsin, is the chairman, and saying, John, you know, don't you think like this is a problem because they all get over the centralized power and they have all this power over artists? I said, look, generally speaking, I'm not in favor of monopolies. At this time, the business is so damaged, you know, it may need this kind of consolidation just to financially survive because of what's happened to the record companies. I said, but let me explain something to you. It doesn't matter if you have the exclusive right to the Meadowlands. I still call the Meadowlands the Izod Center. You know, it's if you don't have Springsteen to fill it up. I mean, and if Springsteen wants to play somewhere else, his fans will go somewhere else. So, at the end of the day, all my, you know, it's the same with record companies or you know, these internet companies. They need artists. The record companies are damaged because their particular unique value has diminished in an electronic digital age, and other people come and go. But you know, the core emotional relationship that's the heartbeat of the business is the enthusiasm that fans have for artists. Now, there are certain types of music that aren't artist-driven, hit songs that are dance songs or things like that where people don't know who the artist is. But the bulk of the business is driven by artists, and artists have the power to show up or not show up. And you know, that's a real power, no matter how the economics or the legalisms or the technology of the business is organized. You know, an artist can always say, I'm sorry, I can't sing, I got a sore throat. That gives them power.
but couldn't the channel of distribution, in this case, a record label, cause the artist to lose power?
Well, it comes and goes. It depends, on which era you're talking about, and how the contracts were organized, and what country you're in. I mean, different countries have different customs. But during the time I've been in the business, once an artist became successful, they had the power. I remember when I was at Warner Brothers. I became chairman of Warner Brothers Records. They're the biggest record company in the world, and it was just a freaky corporate thing. I didn't last very long in this particular job because of other corporate upheavals, but for a little less than a year, I had, that was the #1 job in the record business. This is in the mid-90s, and so I was at some party, and Madonna was there, and Chris Isaac comes over, and he says to Madonna, "I see you're standing next to Power," and she says, "You mean I'm standing next to myself?" And she was absolutely right. It's like, what the fuck did she care what I cared what she thought of me. She didn't care what I thought of her. And by the way, she's very nice to Madonna. Her music never moved me, but very, very nice to, was very nice to me. And but come on. There were all the stories. Ahmet Ertegun, the most legendary record executive of our lifetime, he passed away a couple of years ago. He created Atlantic Records and helped put together Warner Records and discovered Ray Charles and later signed the Rolling Stones. But the stories about him signing the Rolling Stones were the stories about him chasing the Rolling Stones all over the world, hanging out for a year, sucking up to them, hoping they would sign with him. He needed, they could have signed with anybody. They chose him, but if he weren't there, they would have picked someone else. They were still the Stones. So that's just been my observation. Now, there have been some particular situations where there were bad contracts or an artist needed promotion at a moment and they didn't get it and they were hurt by it, and there's certainly a lot of bad things have happened at the expense of artists in the business. And there's no one sentence that could explain all of it, but in general, the trend from the mid-'60s, and sort of when the Beatles started through now, has been an increase in the power of artists. And we see this in all of entertainment. I mean, athletes today have much more power. You read about baseball players in the '60s, they got paid, $80,000 a year, and now they get paid, $10-15 million a year. And movie stars, the studios used to have the power, and now the stars have more power. In general, the trend has been for talent in all areas to have more power relative to business.
So is it content or the distribution that has the power?
I'm a content guy, but there are people that have made a lot of money in distribution. I mean, the reality is they both do. It's not either or. It's but my own path has been working, on the content side. But certainly, if you talk to Steve Jobs, he has a pretty good argument that the distribution that iPods are pretty powerful. So but it's not so bad to be U2 either. So
Another one of my quotes that I really enjoyed in the book was the phrase "association with big hits." I mean, I guess that's true. It's always been true.
Well, for people that are in the business that aren't actual musicians or songwriters or singers, the rest of us, whether it's concert promoters or managers or record producers or record executives, it's a little unclear who deserves credit for what. And all of us try to take as much credit as we can. Sometimes deserved and sometimes undeserved. But the fact is that if you're just associated with something successful, it's the same in the TV or movie business. If you're the agent for a big movie star, or if you're the studio executive involved with whatever, The Watchmen or something. People treat you as if you just added 50 IQ points. And then when you're not associated with hits, you're just a schlep. So there's an irrationality, and you just got to ride the waves when they're going up and not get too hard on yourself when they're going down, because the rest of the world, because nobody knows exactly who does what, kind of treats people as either geniuses or nobodies or has-beens. And we've all seen this with different managers and record executives and people. But there's just no question, when you're associated with a song that everyone's heard on the radio and can hum, you meet people. Even when you're a parent, you go to the the school things with the other parents. All the other parents are suddenly nicer to you, and it's just the way it is.
So obviously, the title of the book is a quote you got from Ahmet.
It's a paraphrase, yeah, from Ahmet Ertegun. At his funeral, David Geffen, who's one of, I think, 3 people that became actually a billionaire through the music business, and who now has been more known as a movie guy. He's been Steven Spielberg's partner for years in DreamWorks, but who started as a manager and then had Asylum Records and then Geffen Records. When he was starting his career, he was Crosby, Stills, Nash's manager, and he who were on Atlantic, and he looked up to Ahmet and he said, "Ahmet, how do I get rich? How do I get rich in the music business? I mean, how do I, and he said, you keep wandering around and then until you bump into a genius, and when you do, hold on and don't let go. That's how you get rich in the music business." So that's certainly the only way I've ever made any money, so hence the title, Bumping into Geniuses.
So you've been around long enough. Who started out, and even today, who are some of your mentors?
Well, the first person I met that was really an inspiration to me, I kind of idolized, is a guy named Jerry Wexler. And he just died, I think, about a year ago, well into his 90s. He was also in Atlantic Records. He wasn't the top guy at Atlantic Records. He was kind of number 2. If any of you saw the movie Ray, the 2 executives depicted in it are Ahmet Ertegun and Jerry Wexler. And Jerry Wexler is the Richard Schiff character. Both of them were much larger than life in real life than they were in the movie, because the movie was about Ray Charles. But in real life, Jerry Wexler had these sunken eyes and this big beard and these broad shoulders. He had this thick Bronx accent and this incredible vocabulary, and just was a very intimidating guy. He was best known as the person who signed Aretha Franklin when she was at Columbia, and they were having her sing all these kind of conventional pop songs. And he gave her the latitude to play the piano and to bring kind of the church intonation that she had, and got her in an environment with other musicians and songwriters where all of her great hits were done for Atlantic. And Jerry Wexler produced those records and was credited, and by Aretha as well, as having been this catalyst. So that was, to me, such like an awesome thing. I mean, Aretha Franklin, they just did a poll, Rolling Stone, a few months ago, who's the greatest singer of all time. And number 1, and they had all artists, journalists, and people in the business vote, and number 1, Aretha Franklin, and Jerry Wexler was the person who facilitated it. So he was certainly someone I just looked up to and idolized and wanted him to kind of say hello when I'd see him at a place, and met him. I got to meet him. In terms of professionally, a mentor was this PR guy named Lee Salters, who I worked for when I met Zeppelin, who just was an old school 40s showbiz PR guy who cared nothing about rock and roll, but who taught me the work ethic, the kind of thing you were talking about, showing up, following up, just the grammar of professional life that's required to be reliable and to have people have confidence in you. And it was really, it's what I never learned in school. I learned from him. So he was certainly an important early mentor. And Peter Grant, the manager of Led Zeppelin, who's a very rough guy. He was 300 pounds, had been a professional wrestler, came from very poor, Cockney, what they call Cockney section of East London, and a tough guy who'd been kind of a thug, and then was literally a professional wrestler, and then a driver, and but brilliant street smarts, and became a manager, kind of the equivalent of some of the people who became big hip hop managers. Just so smart that the fact that he was from the wrong side of the tracks didn't matter. And what he embodied was that thing about the power of the artist. He was, when he it used to be the concert promoters would split 50-50 the profits from a concert, and he said he wanted 90%, and they all freaked out. And he just said, I'd promote Led Zeppelin for 10%. It's a guaranteed sellout. Like what, it's like he just got the paradigm shift, and every manager after that got 90% of the net. It was like overnight it changed it. But he was that guy, and he's still idolized in England by all the managers. Paul McGuinness will tell you that he was U2's manager, that he models his thing after Peter Grant. But he was a tough guy, and there were a lot of drugs around him, which I didn't like. But he was he dealt with the record company, with the promoters, that if you don't love Led Zeppelin, if you don't respect Led Zeppelin, you. That and it worked, and it was it gave me that attitude always, that's the way to be. You don't have to be rude about it and intimidating, but to understand that the artist, no matter what the contract says, and no matter what kind of suit the other person is wearing or what their education is, that an artist with fans has power in a relationship in the entertainment business. And that was a great guy to be exposed to early in my career.
Another celebrated manager you reference in your book, Don Arden.
Mm-hmm.
He's, well, I guess he's Ozzy Osbourne's father-in-law. Was.
Yeah, Don Arden was sort of actually Peter Grant's boss before that. He was older than Peter. I'm sorry that this thing keeps bumping. I don't know how to stop it, though. If anyone can tell me what I'm doing wrong, I'll stop. He was really like a friend of British gangsters, and very proud of it. And I wasn't as close to Don as I was to Peter, but it was fun to meet him. And I did PR for Electric Light Orchestra, who he managed, and his daughter Sharon Arden later became Sharon Osbourne, and definitely she learned everything she knows from her dad.
The other one, Albert Grossman,
Mm-hmm.
American.
Well, Albert Grossman was my absolute idol, because Bob Dylan was and still is kind of my favorite artist. A lot of us hippie generation guys, that's the guy. And I'm one of those cliche guys who still listens to Bob Dylan when I'm depressed. And there had been a documentary called Don't Look Back about Bob Dylan's tour of England. I think it was the 1966 tour. And there were very few rock documentaries at that time. I mean, this was before the age of video. You had to have film cameras, and it was more expensive and cameras. There were very, very few rock documentaries. There was one about the Stones called Gimme Shelter. There was Woodstock. But before Woodstock, there was this and Albert Grossman's like this character in the movie, and he's like, sticking up for Bob Dylan, and he's joking around with Bob Dylan, and everybody is sort of sucking up to Albert. And Albert Grossman had this like long white hair and a ponytail. He kind of looked like pictures of Benjamin Franklin, and this sort of snobbish, intimidating personality. And it was like, wow, I mean, who is it? I mean, I knew I wasn't a songwriter, a singer, or a musician, but this was a guy that was like in the room joking around with Dylan. So that was like, to me, the ultimate guy to even meet. And then I got to meet him, and I worked for him for a while. He's similar to Peter Grant in that understanding of that the artist, part of that paradigm shift of the artist having more power. And, the labels used to say, you have to, a single has to be, 3 minutes or else it won't get played on the radio. And like a Rolling Stone was like 7 minutes. And, Grossman was the guy who said, hey, it's 7, take it or leave it. It became a #1 song and so on. So he was the same kind of guy. I mean, of the three, Peter Grant was the one I spent the most time with. Historically, Albert Grossman's probably the most significant because just of that movie and because Dylan was such a catalyst for the change in a lot of different aspects of the business.
You mentioned Grossman in the film Don't Look Back. So segueing to the film side of your career. So in 2009, hard to understand, what's the big deal about No More Nukes? A film about a lot of rock and roll guys, gathering together to protest something. Gosh, we see that on the nightly news. There's documentaries every time you turn on the TV. There's documentary channels. I mean, how do you put it in the context, going backwards, looking at it, because it really was a significant movement, and it was the first time something had done. And not only you had the album, you had the documentary, and the actual live event. I mean,
and the movie.
Yeah, well, the documentary.
Yeah, the documentary, right.
So it's hard for somebody to sit here and look back and say, so what's the big deal? I'm trying to frame it in a reference why it was such a important big deal, and how, I mean, for you, that was the first time you did something.
For me, I got to meet Bruce Springsteen. But
was that what it was about?
No, but it was a good thing.
Okay.
I mean, in '79, it was sort of 3/4 of the way through the Jimmy Carter's presidency, but the hostages in Iran hadn't been taken yet, which ended up shadowing the last year of his presidency. Prior to that, a very big story that gripped the interest of the country was a meltdown of a nuclear reactor in 3 Mile Island, Pennsylvania. And it was not a complete disaster. I think a few people died as a result of exposure to contamination. The cancer rate went way up, with certain people. But the potential for a Chernobyl-type disaster was there. And it had been in the context of the previous few years of a number of activists and scientists warning about this possibility of it happening, is that there were environmental dangers, that this radiation, that containing it, that science and technology was not perfect, and any little mistake where this stuff leaked out, you could kill a lot of people. I mean, the worst one happened in Russia with Chernobyl. And it was relatively new in the environmental movement, and there were different people into this. There was this movie called Silkwood that was about a woman named Karen Silkwood that Meryl Streep starred in, who said that some company was having unsafe reactors and this and that. And along this time, some rock people got interested in it. A particular guitar player of a band called Orleans. That had a few hits in the 70s. One of them was called Still the One, another was called Dance With Me. You'll still hear them sometimes in commercials. And they were kind of a bar band. They were never a super big band, but they had 2 #1 singles and popularity, and I had done PR for them. And John Hall had been a physics major in college and lived in Saugerties, which is near Woodstock, New York, and heard that they were going to build a nuclear power plant near his home and freaked out and decided that he wanted to organize celebrities and musicians to protest the building of nuclear power plants for environmental reasons. And then Jackson Browne, who was at the peak of his career then, he just had a big #1 record called Running on Empty, had a similar interest because he was really into Native American spirituality, and there was a movement among Native Americans to stop uranium mining in South Dakota, uranium mining producing one of the main elements in nuclear power, and they got together and organized James Taylor and other 70s type rock people, and then 3 Mile Island happened, so there was suddenly the ability to command the attention. So there were 5 nights at Madison Square Garden to raise money, all of which went to this foundation that was set up that disseminated it to different grassroots groups fighting nuclear power in their communities, and we made a movie out of it. Springsteen agreed to be part of it. It was the first political thing Springsteen ever did, and it was some of the first film footage ever of Springsteen, and he was kind of made bigger by that. And Gil Scott-Heron was part of it, who I'd also gone to high school with. It was a really amazing thing to see someone that I went to high school with become like really one of the great I think progenitors of hip-hop. I think a lot of people would say he helped almost invent the art form, and it was exciting to me that he was part of it. And and we made a movie of it, and I think that movement was pretty successful. I mean, they'll complain today, the nuclear industry, that because of these ridiculous left-wingers, there have been very few nuclear plants constructed for the last 30 years. And I don't think the concerts caused it, but I think the concerts were part of a movement that created an awareness in communities that people could be left-wing or right-wing, Republican or this or that, but nobody wants a nuclear waste dump in their particular neighborhood. They don't want cancer, regardless of what their politics are, and there's just not a credibility that they can keep it safe. So that was it was really the environmental movement focusing on nuclear power. Now, I don't pretend to be an expert on the technology and why France has so many nuclear power plants and no accidents, and maybe it's safe now. It's not like I haven't studied enough to know now. But at the time, it also was an empowering thing for a lot of musicians in terms of the ability for musicians to influence politics, because during the Vietnam War, there had been sort of people like the Jefferson Airplane and others that would talk about stopping the war and the civil rights movement. You had Joan Baez and Bob Dylan and Mahalia Jackson sing at the March on Washington. But from sort of the end of the war till the end of the 70s, there were 7 or 8 years where it seemed like that was forever severed, that there was just no more connectability between pop culture and politics. And the No Nukes concerts helped usher in a new cycle that then after that came We Are the World and You know, you see it today with Bono with his stuff, and you know, it sort of created a space in the culture where a certain kind of artists felt kind of if they were going to be taken seriously, they needed to stand for something other than just having hit music. And you know, over the years, some journalists have made fun of artists, and some of them say stupid things. But I would much rather have artists influencing our politics than people on Wall Street. You know.
You know, in continuing your activist role and political leanings, you also, for a while, got back into the media. Well, you got into the media with radio.
Briefly, and again unsuccessfully, but I did. Yes, for 15 months I was the CEO of Air America Radio, an ill-fated corporation, but it did produce what's I think going to be a U.S. Senator from Minnesota, Al Franken, and a big cable TV star in Rachel Maddow. So we did have some good byproducts of that effort.
Just amazing career when you look at all those things that you've done and survived and continue, and just like I said, still have time to be a family guy.
As you said at the beginning, showing up is a big deal. You show up every day, you never know what's going to happen. You know, you just keep trying, because God knows there's been setbacks. But showing up is a big deal.
I just want to open it up to some questions here that some of the students.
He had a question. Did you write yours down? Okay, good.
So Nick wanted to know, what was your biggest accomplishment personally in the business, and what was this related to via big income?
Well, the best income was getting fired from 2 corporations. I had good parachutes from Warner's and from Polygram. I mean, I didn't do it on purpose, but that's just the sad fact of the weird American system. So that's just what happened. I don't know, you know, with accomplishments, I'm somebody that really tries to stay in the moment and focus on what I'm doing now. I mean, I think my biggest accomplishment is that I still am in the business now after all these years, and I'm able to go to work every day and work with artists and hope, you know, make a living and sometimes enjoy it. You know, to separate out any individual accomplishment just seems a little contrived to me. I think the greatest artist I ever worked with historically was Nirvana. I mean, there was just nothing to compare with that moment for me. I mean, there's other great moments, but for me personally, to have managed that band, to have been that close to them and have them have the extraordinary success and influence all over the world, and the relationship I had, and then the tragedy of Kurt's suicide, that was for me the greatest artist I worked with, because he was just uniquely brilliant, and I worked with him at exactly the time that he did the work that he's the most known for. But I don't think I particularly accomplished much. I was just sort of lucky to be there and did the best I could. You know, I don't think it was my best work, but it was the best thing I was involved with.
And someone asked the question, what was your favorite aspect of working with Kurt Cobain?
I just, you know, any time that he was not on drugs was great. He was so nice. I mean, he was a very, very lovely person. Any darkness he had, which was obviously profound, was aimed at himself and not at others. Very, very nice to me personally. But my favorite part of it was whenever to watch him be creative, whether it was writing a song or performing. I mean, he was just so creative and so kind of got it right the first time, and so always the smartest person in the room. That was the you know there's been other people like that, but nobody that I work with up close like that.
How did you choose the records you were going to spend your time on?
They kind of choose me. You know, you can't. It's just opportunity. You know, a lot of great records I don't get a chance to work with, but you know, you see what your choices are and you pick the best one at the time. And it depends what job I had, but a lot of it is circumstance. It's not like you can look at all the records in the world and say I like this one. There are a lot of things I'd love to be involved with that I don't have access to. But you know, among the ones you have access to, you pick the ones that seem to be the best bets. Like I said earlier, a combination of commerciality and love.
This goes back to our journalism as a stepping stone. You mentioned that press is the easiest way to break music. Does that hold true today? And if not, what method would you employ?
I don't understand. What do you mean to break music? You mean to break into the business, or to help an artist become successful? The word break, I'll do I mean, I think that in terms of getting into the business, for me, it was the easiest way, because first of all, I didn't have any other talents. I mean, there's accountants and lawyers and engineers and musicians and all sorts of other people who get in through other ways. I mean, obviously, having computer skills is incredibly valuable today. But for me, being a journalist was a way in, And it was a low barrier of entry. Like I said, you don't need an investor. And today with all these blogs, you may not be able to get the audience that you could as a Rolling Stone writer in '67, but you can get into the bloodstream of the culture, without a huge investment. And obviously, if you're a musician and have musical talent, that's a better way in. But for those of us that don't, writing is a way in.
Good question here. Why didn't anyone want to cover Woodstock?
Well, it's not that nobody wanted to cover Woodstock. It's that nobody at Billboard magazine wanted to cover Woodstock. And that had to do with the culture of that trade magazine, was that there were people that were older. I was 19, and the other writers seemed very old to me. I guess they were in their 30s, but they were like these old middle-aged guys at the time. And they didn't care anything about the rock culture. Their idea of a good assignment was going to a club like the Copacabana, where you got free drinks and dinner. Those were the prized assignments. The best ones were drinks and dinner, and the second best were drinks. And anything without drinks or dinner was already a tertiary assignment, and something that you had to schlep up to the country. Nobody wanted to cover it. So I was the low man on the totem pole, and the only one but to me, it was like the greatest assignment in the world. I was like a kid. I was Hendrix and Janis Joplin in the band, and so. But to the other writers, it was like a trip to the dentist for them to have to schlep up and not get free drinks and dinner. So it was a generational thing. It was that they were older and not into that music.
This question kind of...
I mean, there were a lot of journalists from other media that were there. I mean, it wasn't like I was the only journalist there. I was just the only journalist from Billboard.
More from a trade.
Yeah, I don't know if there were people from the other trades there. I think you're right. I may have been the only one from the trades.
This person is sort of looking for an analysis from you that's saying that you were involved and worked with Nirvana, and you saw what the impact it did on music and the culture. Is there any band or artist around today you think that can make that same impact?
Yeah, I'm not sure. There's some very interesting artists. I mean, I'm really impressed with MIA and her ability to cross international lines and musical lines and cultural lines. Now, she's married this billionaire now, so I'm not sure she's going to be as motivated to do that work. We'll see. But I thought that what she did on the last album was culturally really exciting. It wasn't commercially as big as Nirvana, but she's pretty young and such an innovative artist. That's just somebody that I really, gotten to me. I know my kids really like My Morning Jacket a lot. My son does. As just from the rock area, that's like a rock band that's emerged with a lot of impact. And and I think Kanye West is pretty impressive what he's accomplished. It's several albums now, and an extraordinary live act, and kind of a cultural voice. It's not the music that I'm as intimate with as I am with rock and roll, but I mean, I think he's a pretty big deal.
Thoughtful question. If you were born in another generation, do you think you still would have been as successful?
I don't know. Hopefully, if I was born in another generation, I would have learned some of the things that other people in that generation learned and given me the tools to deal with that. If I was born in another generation only knowing what I knew when I was 17, I would have been. But I think it's a mysterious thing what people do and how they find their lives, and I just don't know. I mean, having two kids, my daughter is a freshman at RISD and my son is a freshman in high school, I certainly do not encourage them to do what I did. I mean, I certainly want them to graduate from college, for example. So that I don't think was a strategy that worked at other times. I think it worked. I think that was a uniquely 60s type of a thing, where there was a generational break and where there were certain people without a conventional education were able to build business careers. That I think was kind of unique to the late 60s, early 70s.
What was your favorite job?
The one I have now.
It's a good one. Do you see the job fields in music expanding, and with touring becoming such a big part of the revenue stream for an artist? Would you suggest somebody look at a record company or a touring company like Live Nation to secure employment?
It's impossible to ever get through one of these things without a question about how to get a job, and I understand that. It's so important. And the answer is, there's no one-size-fits-all. There's no question record companies are declining. that doesn't mean there aren't record companies, and some of the companies that are now called record companies are going to become talent companies. They're involved with management and songwriting as well as records, because they call it these 360 deals, because there's still a need for people who have some finance behind them to market music and to take financial risks on music. So whatever they're called, talent-based companies, whether record companies or management companies, are going to continue to exist, and that'll be one job. And there'll be concerts. You're absolutely right. The questioner that concerts have not been affected by the internet, and they won't be, because there's a social experience of going out to a concert that you can't get from a computer or a cell phone. So that's a more stable part of the business. But I don't know whether being a concert promoter, you know, it depends what you want to do, and you know, there's still people that are you know, the ability to understand and master Pro Tools is really important for certain roles in the business. And you know, there's no one answer, but there's no question that record companies have dramatically shrunk, and that there's far fewer jobs available at record companies than there were 10 years ago. So, you know, and they're less important than they were 10 years ago. I mean, I was in Portland trying to sign some band, and dinner with different people, and there was a guy from Nike. I said, "What do you do?" He says, "I'm the vice president of music at Nike." What the f*** is that? You know, but they did so much with, there was a type of an iPod thing with a shoe that they were selling, and they used music in their commercials and in their in-store displays. And there was a guy who has that job, you know. So that's like you getting the job at Atlantic. That's a hell of a job for a young guy to get, you know, vice president of music at Nike. So they're unusual places. The importance of music in TV shows, some of the supervisors for shows like Grey's Anatomy have a kind of influence over the culture that never existed in those jobs before, whereas it used to be people at radio stations were tastemakers, and now they're usually run by computers. Steve's place is an exception, where they still have live human beings, you know, but so there's a lot of different ways in, and whatever I would say today, it'll be a little different 2 or 3 years from now. I just think you got to kind of keep your antennae out. But there's no question record companies, although they still exist, are smaller. But there'll be somebody from here that might get a job at a record company and have a great career. There's just fewer of those paths. But there need to be, I mean, you got to break down what did record companies do. And to me, it's 3 things. It was investment in artists. Someone would put up some money so an artist could quit their day job and focus on songwriting and recording and introducing their music to the public. They have to make a living. Number 2, marketing, getting the word out, because just putting something on the internet doesn't mean anything unless there's marketing behind it. There's 8 zillion things on the internet. How are you going to find an individual song? You need somebody that has the connections or the resources, whether it's advertising or figuring out how to get a song into a movie or whatever. And distribution. So distribution is not a factor anymore. Distribution is available to anybody because of the internet. That has gone away. But investment and marketing are still vital, whether it comes from a record company or a music publisher or a manager or a dope dealer or a cell phone company. Someone's got to do it, because otherwise it's just a song out there or a group of songs out there in the mass of 8 zillion blogs and MySpace pages. So I don't know that the major labels are going to be as important. I don't think they will be. I think they have a bit of an advantage because they still own these catalogs of old songs that are attractive for licensing to movies and television and commercials, and that's one of the pillars of marketing. But there's a proliferation of indie labels and indie companies, and there's a lot of opportunity for non-big corporate entities to be successful, but not with no money. You still need some money. You don't need a multi-billion-dollar parent, but you can't just do it with a wing and a prayer and a computer, unless you're unbelievably lucky or the greatest genius that ever walked the earth. For mere mortals, you got to find some way of financing it.
Doug Morris, in addressing students at Fordham University, was asked, you know, why do you need a major label? And he said, you're always going to need a record label because the internet has yet to singularly by itself break a artist, a song, a band, and that people still need the element of discovery and a filter. And he said nothing yet to date has supplanted that role that the labels still do.
Isn't that kind of what I just said?
Well, I just want to know if you totally agreed with that.
Well, I don't think you need a major label. I think you need some energy, some group team of people. It can be with very limited funding. I mean, I have a client called School of Seven Bells. It's kind of a weird techno rock act. And the guy spent $300 on the record. You know, he did it all with Pro Tools. And he's on this tiny little label called Ghostly International. It doesn't even have major distribution. It's two guys that the dance label out of Michigan. But he used to be in Secret Machines, and he got to be friends with The Edge, and The Edge talked about them in a U2 interview in Rolling Stone. And, you know, it created a buzz. It just came out in October, and they were selling out 400 or 500 seats all over Europe and all over the Northeast. But now we're pressuring Ghostly International into getting some investment to hire some independent promotion and to hire a PR firm, to do more advertising, to make a video. And they're going to get some kind of financial partner because they can't take it all the way. But they're going to own a piece of it, and they deserve it, and they're very, very indie company. So I don't think you need Universal Music to break an act, but I don't think you can just do it with nothing. I think you need some of the elements of labels, but it doesn't have to be a record company. It could be, I say, a management company. It could be, you know, anything. It could be any company that's willing to take a financial risk and motivate some people. In general, I think experienced, smart, hardworking people are more useful in breaking an artist than stupid, lazy, inexperienced ones. In general, it's better to have a little more money than a little less money. The odds are better. And it doesn't have to be major labels, but the idea that just on your own you can magically reach a mass audience by being kind of smart and good looking and putting something up on YouTube, that's a myth. And that's what I think he was getting at. On the other hand, I think he overstates the importance of major labels because, you know, that's his gig, is to sell his brand.
So what do you, if you look at the future, what do you see the role of a major label in the business and as a business model?
Well, right now their expertise is narrowed to pop. That for rock bands, for niche artists of all kinds and all genres, they don't have the marketing staff anymore to make a difference because those are the people that got fired. When you hear about thousands of people getting fired, it's mostly marketing people. What's left in the marketing area is home runs. Selling somebody from American Idol, Taylor Swift, you know, people that have the exact zeitgeist pop, hip-hop single, you know, Sean Kingston a couple of years ago, or Lady Gaga is the, you know, a recent one. That kind of music, the majors still have an advantage because they have an infrastructure of pop promotion that is hard for independent people to compete with. But for established artists like Radiohead or the Eagles, they've completely eliminated record companies, sold direct to retail. And for a lot of niche artists in different genres, they've been able to find good audiences without the majors. So the trend is away from the majors in terms of new repertoire. The majors, of course, still have by far the biggest catalogs as far as the licensing business goes. But in general, they're declining. They're not going to disappear, but they're declining, I think, irreversibly.
So their role will basically be a catalog.
And pop. They still have more
Catalog
clout
and
and pop. Pussycat Dolls, these kind of things. It's hard for an indie label to do that.
And then what would you see as possibly the next killer app? Because I hear discussions that possibly that would be a filter that would help you identify what music you like.
That's not my strong suit. I'm sure people here would know better than me. It's a young person's area. I hope I recognize it earlier rather than later, but I'm certainly not going to be the first one to know about it.
Okay, so then we'll go back to a question somebody asked from the book. You stated that the music industry was remade in the late 60s and 70s by businessmen who wanted to be closer to the artists they admired. Would you say this is true of the businessmen industry today? And did this influence your decision to leave the major label world?
No, the reason I left the major label world was because I was fired. No one quits those jobs. My boss, at both times I was fired was because my boss was fired and the new guy wanted his own person. So I wasn't fired for like stealing or getting stoned on the job or anything like that. It was just my boss got fired, so the new guy wanted a new number two. I think right now most people getting into the business do have an enthusiasm about music because there was a time in the 70s and 80s where you had a lot of people from kind of Wall Street or Harvard types that just thought it was like a place to get rich and had all this glamour. Now the business has been sort of ridiculed for the decline of the record companies. It's harder to make money. So Well, you end up as a lot of people who really like music. So I think actually the kind of people that get into the business now are more music people similar to the 60s, whereas I think in the 70s, 80s, and 90s you had an influx of people who just, it was like the place to be. You know, now you got to like music. If you don't like music, there's no reason to get into the music business. It's a tough way to make a buck. Although not an impossible way, you know. Like, I mean, to me, the big, you know, there's no secret. That's the big, in fact, I wrote about this in the book, you know. Jerry Wexler, when I first met him, I said, hey man, you know, I said, are you going to there was a conference coming up, one of these music business conferences. I said, are you going to that? I'm trying to get into the conversation with this great man. He said, I never go to those things. He says, because two reasons. First of all, the premise is that people like you will go there to learn secrets. Well, first of all, there aren't any secrets. And secondly, if there were any secrets, people like me wouldn't tell you what they are.
Jerry.
If I had the secret, I would tell you. There's no secret. You do the best you can, and usually that's enough. But not getting discouraged easily is huge, because there's going to be tremendous disappointments, anything to do with entertainment. So you gotta take a punch, and you know, try not to burn bridges, because you know it's all those cliches. You know, the same thing. Now, having said that, I just today burned a bridge with somebody. I'm 58, and I just screamed at some lawyer, and they'll never do business with me again. So it's easier to say than to do, but it's better to. That's it, man. And then try to, you know, do your homework, learn about everything. Knowledge is power. All those regular cliches. The challenge is to keep your eye on two balls at the same time. The ball of why you got into it in the first place, because if you can keep that enthusiasm, it's a happier life, and you have the advantage of connecting with people, because creative people feel that. And at the same time, keeping your eye on the ball of the math, because the money has to work. You can't do things that are mathematically irrational and survive in the business. And balancing those two things is always the challenge, and sometimes I've been too much one way and sometimes too much the other. You know, I don't know, but the goal is to have them in the proper balance.
Having been on both sides as a manager and a label executive, comment on the 360 deal.
Well, the 360 deal is a term that was created by lawyers and people that talk to Wall Street. The phrase was invented so that record company, the people who had to explain to analysts on Wall Street what the record business was going to do given the decline of CD sales, created this idea that they could use their marketing prowess and money, the two things I said before, investment and marketing, to get percentages of all of the income of an artist. Now, of course, managers who represent artists, like the current job I have always been involved in 360. We get, you know, a typical manager will get 15% of all the different income streams. The record companies, especially the big record companies, historically just focused on records. For years, decades, that was fine because the value of the recordings was so great. It literally created billionaires. Richard Branson, the creator of Virgin, David Geffen, who I mentioned, and others, you know, people like Berry Gordy, creator of Motown, $500 million, and so on. And then the decline of the value of those assets, you know, created this crisis, and they said, well, you know, what are we going to do? So it's not totally insane for the record companies to say, listen, if we're spending $1 million, 10 years ago, we'd spend that $1 million and we could sell, you know, on a successful record, a couple of million records, it's $20 million of income. And now, for that same risk, a hit is only, you know, 20% of that. And we have the same batting average we had before. How could we possibly justify taking these risks? That's not crazy. However, culturally, the problem is that they fired so many people that they want to participate in things like touring and merchandising and songwriting, but there's nobody that knows anything about these things. So a lot of us are very dubious about committing artists to these kind of deals, except in very particular situations. Now, the 3 13-year-old girls I managed, I signed to S Curve Records. It's run by Steve Greenberg, the guy who signed and developed the Jonas Brothers and Hanson, probably the most brilliant guy at Kid Acts. He's risking hundreds of thousands of dollars on eighth graders. I gave him a 360 deal. I mean, he deserves it. He's taking a huge risk on totally unproven talent, and his own contribution is unusually high. On the other hand, for an act that already has a following, the Hives, who I imagine already sell thousands of tickets all over the world, and you know, 100,000 euros a night at festivals in Europe, you know, Universal, the company that used to be with Interscope, said, you know, we'll pick up the option, but we want it to be 360. He said, we'll put up $400,000, you know, it's like, and we want 10% of everything. So I said, do you have any idea what they make live? This is Rand Hoffman, this is a senior executive at Universal. He says, no. I said, well, 10% of what they made live last year is already more than $400,000. So why would they do this? He says, oh, well, let me check. I'll get back to you on what I mean. So on some levels, there's a real jive, superficial notion to it. But I think somebody's going to invest and risk money. They have to have an incentive. Nobody risks money. You know, there are rules of the marketplace. You know, if you're going to have a high risk, you've got to have a high reward. Investing in new artists is a high risk. It's not like, I was going to say it's not like buying real estate, except that's become a little risky. But, you know, even today, I think investing in artists is riskier. And so you've got to give people incentive to take that risk. And there's going to be more and more things that resemble a 360 deal, but the majors are not necessarily going to be the people that really do it. Live Nation did it with Madonna and Jay-Z and U2 because coming from the point of view of the concert promoter, they had more financial resources available, and the collateral of the guaranteed concert attendance was much more meaningful than the record sales. So they become a bank for a 360 relationship. And you know, but on the Pussycat Dolls, when Jimmy Iovine found these dancers and said, why don't you be a group, and I'll make videos with you, and I'll make records with you, and I'll get the best songwriters and producers to do it. Not only did they have a 360 deal, but of course they deserved it. I mean, they contributed as much as the artist did. So on the other hand, Arcade Fire from Montreal, who creates everything themselves and builds a following on their own through alternative media, barely needs a record company. So you know, they own their own masters and their own publishing and do short-term deals with everybody. So you've got all different types of models depending on the artist. But the notion that people are going to look more holistically at the music business rather than just one segment called the record business is true.
Talk to us a little bit more of a Care Bears on Fire as far as what we can expect musically.
You know, I don't have I told you I wasn't a great journalist. I don't know how to verbalize. You know, the theory of it culturally is that these are girls who listen to a lot of punk rock, Ramones, Patti Smith, and things like this, and sort of they're to be the anti-Miley Cyrus. Not in the sense of being profane because they're 13 and they're trying to appeal to a young audience, but they play their own instruments. It's guitar-driven. There's kind of a punky twist to the lyrics. They're from Brooklyn. They're not people that are the product of stage mothers. They're students. They're doing their homework while they're in the studio. And there's a feeling that we have that maybe there's, in that young audience, which is so incredibly powerful economically, that there's a yearning for an alternative to the Disney-created kid groups. And that's what the Care Bears on Fire are trying to do with their music and the way we're presenting them. And as I said, I've got a great partner in it, and Steve Greenberg, who's had 2 gigantic successes in the past addressing, you know, the kid audience. And Sophie Kazakov, who's the lead singer, guitar player, and main songwriter, is really good for, you know, not just for a 13-year-old, but for any age. She's got that eye of the tiger, and we'll see if it works.
And some of the other artists you have forthcoming releases from Tom, you said Tom
Well,
Morello.
I played you in the car. Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine just put together a new group with Boots Riley, who's from a kind of progressive hip-hop group called The Coup, and they're calling it Street Sweeper, and they're touring with Jane's Addiction and 9 Inch Nails, and we're going to get this out somehow in the next couple of months. It's the first thing since Rage Against the Machine that Tom has done that's going right for the Rage audience. It's he's done things with acoustic guitar, he's experimented a lot, and this is the first thing that's trying to be that thing, and I hope it works. I'm pretty excited about it, but, you know, I'm prejudiced.
And amazing singer-songwriter, Steve Earle.
Steve Earle, I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. He's more my generation, but he's a great singer-songwriter, a great, very interesting guy. He also has done acting. He had a recurring role on that HBO series, The Wire. He was the AA counselor of the character Bubbles, for any of you that saw it, the guy with a southern accent, and he's finishing a novel. He's, you know, what a great troubadour. The record he's putting out in May is actually the first album he's done of other people's songs. He had a mentor named Townes Van Zandt, who was a Texas singer-songwriter who died young in the 80s, and that's called Townes, and that's coming out. And if anybody likes that kind of Dylan-ish troubadour type music, he's one of the great modern exponents of it.
And then from the Cranberries, you have Dolores.
And Dolores O'Riordan of the Cranberries has a record coming out, and I expect all of these people to get a lot of exposure on Sirius. But, you know, there's a zillion good records out. I'm lucky to work with a few people. Again, it's a narrow band of the full culture. I try to do what I can relate to, and the people around me can. There's 50 or 60 different scenes happening all at the same time, and they don't even necessarily know about each other. And they're all valid if they have an audience. And the nature of music is, you know, a few 100,000 fans you can have a great career with. So in a world of billions of people, there's room for so many different kinds of music. So I happen to only know about a few different kinds. There's a lot of other things happening that I'm sure people here know much more about than me.
Okay. Any other questions for our guest? Okay, well then, I'm going to thank you for coming.
Thank you.